Hello, and welcome to the Critical Path Institute podcast. Our goal for this podcast is to connect the dots among our core competencies in regulatory science, biomarkers, data management and standards, clinical outcome assessments, and modeling and analytics, and how we accelerate drug development. CPath created this podcast for researchers, clinicians, and industry and regulatory professionals with the hope that these conversations and the resources we share will advance your efforts and partnerships to improve global health.
Hello and welcome to eCOA Conversations, a podcast brought to you by the Critical Path Institute's eCOA Consortium. My name's Scottie Kern and I'll be your host for what we hope will be a series of frank and honest discussions where we will speak to industry veterans and thought leaders around what's good and possibly not quite so good in the fields of eCOA and digital health technologies. Our guests today are drawn from the ranks of the eCOA Consortium membership, and it's an absolute pleasure to introduce the panel of experts joining me in this conversation today. After I introduce each of the panelists, I'm going to ask each of them to give us a little background into how they got into eCOA in the first place. So let's start off with Dr. Florence Mowlem, the Chief Scientific Officer at uMotif. Hey, Flo.
Hi, Scottie. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I did some work on a PRO measure during my PhD, and I think that was my first experience of the COA world, though slightly different to how it operates on the pharma side of things. And I was also working on clinical trial data sets, and I think I realised that I didn't want to stay in academia and I wanted to be even closer to that impact. So then ended up working in organisations that provide digital health solutions for clinical trials, and I've worked at a mixture of more established companies and then more of the newcomers, the startups. So I've had a good experience of both of those, and it's great to be here today.
Thank you, Flo. Our next panelist is Dr. Karl McEvoy from YPrime. He's the Vice President of eCOA and Patient Technologies and part-time foodie. So, Karl, what brought you into our funny little space?
Hey, Scottie. Thanks for having me. So oddly, I kind of ended up here by accident. I have a background in microbiology and neuroscience, and during my degree and my PhD, I looked into therapeutics for various different conditions, and drug discovery was something that just really interested me. I moved to the UK shortly after my PhD and honestly took a job at an eCOA vendor without even realizing what eCOA was. The plan was to get back into research and get into an academic institute or into a pharma company doing research. And I genuinely just fell in love with the industry. It was really nice to see the other side of the coin. So having moved from discovering novel therapeutics to then seeing how those therapeutics are put into a clinical trial and how we get the patient's voice and genuinely understand where they impact how patients live was just something that once I fell into, really enjoyed. So I've been in the industry for about 12 years now, and before joining YPrime had worked at another vendor and at a large pharmaceutical sponsor, and still really enjoying the space, and I get to come and sit and chat with you people, so always a bonus.
Excellent, thank you, Karl. And also we have Brian Lillis, the Director of Clinical Outcome Technologies at ICON, who has fought his way out from the sickbed to be with us today, and we're very grateful you did, Brian. So how did you get into this game, Brian?
Yeah, it's a good question, Scottie, and thanks for having me. Look, after I finally left academia, I milked that to the very last. I've been pretty much working in e-clinical technology for the last maybe 12, 13 years. I worked a lot on, document exchange solutions, e-consent, training, learning management, and so on. A lot of site-facing solutions. Opportunity then came up internally to take over really the management of the implementation of eCOA within ICON about maybe 3.5 years ago. So I said, time to try something new. And I found myself here ever since. And I have to say, it's a very, very different world, and something where I've glad that I did, because I've learned an awful lot, and a very, very interesting area that goes far beyond just the technology.
Thank you, Brian. There's a real case study in the interest of the word different there. We could dwell on that quite a way, but let's get into the meat of the discussion. As a group, you've got some really interesting differences in perspective on this. So let me come to you, Karl, and ask you first, in your opinion, what really is an ePro partner?
That's a good question, Scotty. I think for me, it's about active involvement, a real collaboration between the sponsor and the vendor. And I guess what I mean by that is meaningful interactions sort of outside of a protocol. So it's very easy for somebody to put out to tender a study being set up. And it's very easy for vendors to jump in and bid and potentially win the award. But if you have a meaningful partnership between both organizations, it means you've got a little bit more experience of each other, knowledge, insight into how work is done. But it also means you can have some, I would say, kind of difficult technical conversations outside of the pressure of a signed contract. And I think that for me is what a real eCOA partner looks like. Somebody who's ready and has some insight into what the sponsor is looking for almost before they ask for it, sort of knowing about pipeline, knowing about roadmap, knowing about where the industry is going. And that, I think, ultimately makes the decision a little bit easier, but also means that ongoing interactions between both groups are a little bit more straightforward.
So it's more than just the scientific discussion then, right?
Yeah, definitely, because there's often so many different business units involved in the discussions and in the conversations. You know, I could absolutely see the four of us sitting on a call as a sponsor / vendor group deciding on things for one study. Each person will have their strengths and weaknesses. You know, somebody will know data management inside out. Somebody will know the operational concerns, things like translations. You know, somebody else might know more of the regulatory piece. Somebody else will be an expert in the specifics of that therapeutic area. So nobody can know all of it, but having the right people together to make those decisions and have some input, I think is always the most straightforward way of running things.
And Flo, it's interesting to me because I've always seen it as principally an operational thing. And yet we've just been talking about, you know, maybe it is beyond just the science, there's more to it, but science is where, you know, in terms of strategy, endpoint strategy, the best approaches in general, that's where the conversation, to me at least, seems where it should start, right?
Yeah, definitely. But I think it depends as well who the sponsor is. I think there's lots of smaller companies who have less experience in eCOA, so maybe they need more of that operational support and guidance. And also it's about, you know, this is eCOA, it's the electronic implementation. So it's about the science of how you do that in the best way, but also there's all the technical considerations that come with it. And I think partnership, as Karl was saying as well, it's a bit more, you know what you're in for, I would say. If you're in a partnership, I think you know what the vendor's capabilities are and what they aren't at the moment or where they're headed. So I feel like there's a bit more understanding there. And also, I think we always talk about the importance of early engagement. And I think as eCOA vendors or technology providers, it's always very tough coming in later in the process because you're bound by very tight timelines and there's lots of moving pieces. Like Karl was saying, there's the translations, there's the licensing, there's UAT, there's all of this. And if you've got a partnership, then perhaps it can facilitate that earlier engagement so you can get ahead of the curve and give yourself more time.
So Brian, from your perspective, where do you sit on this eCOA partner concept?
Yeah, look, this is something that's close to my heart, Scotty. Like, look, I'm responsible for maybe implementation of eCOA and something like 150 ongoing studies right now. Critical that we have a very good partnership, whether we're using our internal platform, whether we're using an eCOA partner in the industry. Typically, the decisions around the science piece have been made earlier in the process, what endpoints, what codes, all that good stuff. You know, we're supporting earlier in the process, but when it comes to me, it's you know, that's decided. And look, what really keeps me awake at night is two things. Look, one, how do we set up the eCOA so we're not impacting the overall startup plan of that study? We cannot be delaying SIVs. We cannot be delaying first patient in. We've got to ensure that we're not delaying the overall study because of the eCOA implementation. And the other piece that would keep me awake at night is the quality of the data set. Are we deploying a robust system that's going to enable us to collect a really robust data set that ultimately will probably be used to determine the true impact of that drug by the sponsors, especially neurology or dermatology type studies, eCOA is primary or secondary endpoint. So, eCOA is absolutely critical to, I would say, how any CRO runs a trial. And it's really important you have a very good e-partner working with you in order to ensure that you meet those goals.
So let's dwell a bit more on that in terms of what's the driver for partnership in that concept? Because to me, and again, back in my many days ago life where I was overseeing a lot of eCOA as the head of ePro patient technologies at Pfizer, is that it was really driven by the need to be more efficient operationally. And it is kind of more than that. Maybe that maps more to your experience, Brian, but there needs to be more to this. And is that in terms of the success you see from the provider side in this, is it part of the challenge that there's a lack of real exploration of the full spectrum of partnership? Are we looking at particular disciplines of the overall, the overall life cycle of ePro and eCOA?
No, if I was to define, what we need in eCOA partnership. So, from our own perspective, we've tried to, a typical scenario where a sponsor might work with an eCOA partner, they're really relying on the eCOA partner for all the scientific input, or the translations, the licensing, all that good stuff end to end. Our relationship is a little bit different. We try and control the eCOA implementation. We do our own licensing. We do our own translations. We do our own UAT. We oversee the implementation end to end. So, our needs around the eCOA partner might be a little bit different to maybe a sponsor or others. So, where we really need partnership is, the ability to deliver, efficiently operationally. Okay, so, the ability to only put forward your platform if you think you can meet the needs of the study. We can't have a mismatch between, say, the technical requirements of the protocol and what the system can support. But I think also, definitely an eCOA's providers experience in creating systems like that for other studies. So ultimately, you are the technical experts. You are the ones who have created these platforms for other studies. Bringing that to the design discussion, bringing that experience to the discussion about what you've seen work well before, what we should incorporate into our system design. And then it's the ability just to solve problems. There's no eCOA deployment without challenges, without problems, without some customer support that's working, without something going wrong with the product, some post-production bug, some quality event. It's just the ability to understand that we're all working together towards a common goal for a sponsor here in order to deliver that data for them, and just working with us to resolve that problem efficiently and as quickly as possible. So that's what I would view partnership. Let's bring your experience, make sure we're going to build the best system that we can, and then help us solve the challenges as they occur. That's how I judge it.
For me, though, do we think we've achieved that? I think we use the term partner a lot or partnership a lot, but I think sometimes when the going's good, yeah, we're partners, but when something goes wrong, I feel like the partnership is no longer there, and it ends up a bit more of a who's to blame. So I feel like there's work to be done.
And I would say typically if you're in a scenario where you're working ad hoc with different providers, there's a lot of multiple providers in the market space. And if you're working with multiple different providers a lot of the time, I absolutely think that can happen. I think if you build up a relationship, and maybe back to Carol's point at the start, where you've worked on a few studies together, maybe multiple studies together, you've established kind of operational playbooks, you've established governance, you've established relationships. I think, this idea, it's their fault and it's not our fault, really kind of disappears, and you can really start to build out the partnership. I'd say challenging to build out a partnership on a one-off study basis, I would say.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think and like I said at the start about meaningful interaction. So if we build a partnership, the governance, the metrics, the KPIs, all of the stuff we monitor at an organizational level allows us to, when things are going well in the partnership, to take that perhaps heated discussion or that issue or the challenge that we've come across, take that away from the study team, hit it at a governance level outside of the stress of running the trial, right? So every trial will have a potential challenge, whether it's paper or eCOA. It's novel therapeutics in unique patient populations globally. Nobody's ever going to do that 100% perfect. And I'd actually argue if things go too well, there's probably a bigger, deeper problem that we just haven't spotted. But I think taking the issue away from the study team and leaving them to focus on getting things right for the trial, for the patients, and continuing to get good quality data and supporting patients and site staff in a good partnership, taking it away and handling it at a governance level, I think is a good reflection of what that partnership truly looks like. And I'd argue if we say we have a partnership and we're still arguing at a study level, there's probably a deeper question to be asked about, are we truly partners or is it a more transactional piece?
I'd completely agree with that, Karl. I think in terms of the partnerships, when we work with external providers, we try to take the heat away from the study team situation. Look, you'd like to think the majority of issues could be solved at a study level, but when more significant challenges, they're taken away from the study team, they're resolved at a governance level and solutions cascaded down. And that does help a lot. So I think eCOA partnership, it needs effective governance relationships. It needs to have a trust between the different providers, whether it's CRO, whether it's eCOA provider, that you're in it together and you're going to work to resolve these things. And to your point, Flo, not going back to pointing fingers, it was their fault kind of thing. Because ultimately, in the world, say, where CRO will operate, like if an eCOA provider is not delivering or there's a challenge, ultimately it's the CRO's responsibility to resolve that. That message isn't going to go down very well for very long. It's up to us to resolve it. So it's in our interest to build out those relationships and partnerships.
So what do we think makes a good eCOA partner from the vendor perspective? And I also want to ask you to think about, and Brian, putting you in a slightly awkward position here, given that you're kind of like the surrogate sponsor, but what makes it good from a sponsor side as well? So let's focus on the vendor side. What do we think makes for a good eCOA partner?
I think good experienced staff is part of it. And what I mean by experience is positive and negative experience. So we've talked a little bit here about issues and things that can crop up in a study. Things just sometimes go wrong. And it's with the best will in the world, with the best provider, the best software, the best people, the best written protocol, the best endpoint hierarchy, we're still going to see things we didn't necessarily expect. And how we handle that and how we address that, I think, is one thing, but actually what you learn from it and then what you take and essentially bring forward to the next study, to the next client, to the next company. I mean, all of the experience you take with you, I think that's, for me, a good example of where a vendor can be separated from a really good vendor or from an excellent vendor. It's about getting the right people and keeping a good level of industry knowledge within the organization. I think that's part of it. And with that comes trust and transparency. If people can give anecdotal evidence and share things honestly and not be too guarded about, company secrets. We all sort of do the same thing to different levels. Some people are better than others at certain therapeutic areas or have a maybe, slightly stronger offering in certain areas, or just maybe more exposure to it. But I think being able to give examples of what you've done in the past, what's worked well, what's been a challenge, what seemed like a good idea at the time, and what we created and put into the ether for the patients to use versus what the patient population actually wanted. They can be very different things. So a vendor who understands that and is confident enough to say that back to a sponsor. And Brian, you kind of hinted on this earlier. If your system doesn't meet the need of the study or the population, don't be afraid to say no. I've worked on the sponsor side too, and I've genuinely been impressed by how some eCOA vendors will come to us and say, you know what, not this time. It's just not right for us. It's not right for the population. We're very happy to say no to this. We know your other vendors are more capable in this space. You should go with them. And then, that means that vendor's trust is still there. And the next time a study comes up, they're still in the running for that. And actually having built some additional trust, I think is something that goes a long way.
I think that point, if I may, Karl, is a huge one about, again, looking back at my time and that time of oversight role, the first vendor that said no to me was the one that I instantly developed a stronger a kind of like appreciation of, maybe even enhance the trust to a degree. So that's part of it as well, right, Flo?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes all the way through to the actual management of studies. I think sponsors would rather know that bad news is coming earlier rather than a few days before a milestone or a deadline. So I think it's about that honest communication and that building that trust from end to end. Because if you've got notice, then you know something's coming, you can think about solutions together, rather than it just falling on one side and then you kind of break the trust and the relationship.
Like from my perspective, look, when I look at the technology, a lot of the technology, it's hard for different providers to differentiate themselves significantly. Like what I think is critical and often underrated is the quality of the project manager on the partner side. I've seen studies where you've got project managers, really complex eCOA studies where project managers on the partner side literally have just come in from managing managing in retail shops and then coming in to manage the most complex eCOA studies. It's just not going to work, So I think having that quality project manager who's actually motivated by the success of that study, I think has a huge difference. I think the other piece is the ability, like Karl was saying and Flo, you were saying, the ability to bring your expertise, whether it's scientific or from a technology, on what you think is going to work for that population on that study. So we're going to have our opinion, but you've worked on more studies than we have, and bringing that expertise and skill set. And look, I think a very important point, because look, I've lived through the pain of this on a couple of occasions, is ultimately technology providers who, I see less of this now, to be quite honest. I think it doesn't happen as much now, but definitely had a, let's just get the win and ask for forgiveness later. But that's no place to be for the provider, for a CRO or for a sponsor. But I do see less of that now. And I would agree to Scottie, the people I've talked to in the industry where they kind of come in and saying, look, we're not playing in this space, or we just don't do this. You actually earn your respect more, than anybody who might say, look, let's give this a go and we hope we can deliver it.
Do we think there is an appreciation though for that expertise? Because I feel like sometimes on the vendor side, the impression can be given that actually you're just technology. You don't necessarily know about all of the science of what you're doing and the best practices. And I know sponsors get very worried about the regulators and guidances from regulators that sometimes aren't always interpreted as accurately. So I feel sometimes the vendors get a bit of a hard time and the expertise isn't appreciated.
Yeah, look, I think what you'll find is a lot of sponsors have various degrees of expertise in relation to eCOA themselves. Like you've some sponsors out there who absolutely are experts in this, and would consider themselves thought leaders in this. And when it comes to particular studies, they would be really heavily guiding the implementation and, coming down firm on what they think is acceptable and not. A lot of people we work with don't really understand eCOA, really kind of strongly reliant on ICON's opinion. And look, thankfully, we have a very strong team. But I think also, in those kind of scenarios, we welcome any expertise that the vendors bring in relation to those particular studies. So I think that could be maybe more kind of sponsor specific. You might see that more with sponsors who have really gone out and tried the old eCOA piece and build that expertise in-house.
So we've touched on, understanding. We've touched on like trust, being confident to say no, but also to Flo's point, a good eCOA partner should have, I guess like integrity in terms of the advice they have. They're not coming from something they just read on a website. They've attended a webinar and tried to port that through to being expertise. There has to be you make an investment, and eCOA is not a cheap thing. Let's be honest, but isn't it? It seems to me to be the case that you should have all those features available to a client to say, if you need scientific input, if you need real help with logistics, if you need to understand what the dynamics are. So, should it be a case that the vendors are kind of pushing it always seemed to me that they were pushing the eCOA partner sort of concept. But it seems to me that it should be a sort of a client or sponsor facing thing or owned element to kind of look for those that can help fill the knowledge gaps to a degree, but also support internal discussions. It doesn't have to be entirely owned by the vendor, but you have people who just know their thing. And we get to work within CPATH with a lot of people that are outcomes research scientists who are very established in their field, have some electronic implementation experience, but they don't know it all. And none of us knows it all. I think we've all volunteered that. But that to me is what a partnership is. We meet, we bring the minds together and we try and find the right solution strategically on a program level. Stop thinking about individual studies, less tactical, but also in the general, the general concept of how you're capturing the patient voice in clinical trials.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the interesting thing is, and maybe we're slightly spoiled within this group, but with exposure to the consortium, both, from the PRO and from the eCOA perspective, there's a whole bunch of individuals. If I gave each of us a sheet of paper and said, name 20 people in this space, we probably would all name largely the same people first, right? We would see that top 10 would probably be a very famous, infamous list. And there are individuals who've been on the sponsor side and the vendor side, and they've worked at CROs. They've gone down the academic route. They've moved around, and with them, they've brought that expertise and experience. And as they move from place to place, they almost become the internal champion for a particular thing at that organization. So, Brian, you sort of touched on this. Organizations have a very different personality almost. So when I go and meet a new client or an existing client, I know, depending on who's in the room, the way that conversation might go. There might be people who have a specific interest, so that we know will be a focus for a conversation. Or there might be people who have a little bit of a blind spot in an area, and they'll expect us to bring the expertise for that particular conversation. So it's knowing the right people to involve. And I think the interesting thing is, as we look around the consortium and we look around industry, those people have moved so much. We've probably all sat in each other's chairs at one point or another, And I think that's a real key to I think bringing knowledge and expertise around the organizations and ensuring that partnership actually does evolve. And I think that's why we're seeing more of this partnership model, because as people flip from one side to another, so for example, from sponsor to vendor, we see that one sponsor might have very similar challenges with all of their vendors, or one vendor might have very similar challenges with all of their sponsors. And actually, I think it's probably why Getting Better Together started through CPATH, right? Because we were all experiencing the same issues almost in silos. And when we got together in a room and went, oh, UAT or comparisons between paper and electronic, why are we still asking these questions? Or how do we interpret this guidance, like the flows point? I think that's where we're starting to see a real shift. I think that's how partnership has grown, because those champions are moving and creating champions as they go,
A key part to maybe our overall offering would be establishing at a portfolio level, program level, how we operate with a sponsor. So we're putting in these manuals, we're putting in these processes, like how do we build our relationship together? How do we deliver better together? How do we work better together? And hugely effective in improving, say, delivery across an entire portfolio. And look, you see eCOA as being important to that, as in, there's advice beyond the study level, even beyond maybe a program of study level. But, you're in there and you're actively talking about, look, eCOA, the importance of it, how we need to work on this together, how we need to partner on this together. And look, you definitely see sponsors responding very well to that. They like the idea of partnership on this. And look, something I have done in my time here is, and I think talks to partnership as well, is I've tried to streamline maybe the number of providers we work with. It's very hard to build partnerships with 12 individual providers out there, Look, ultimately, everybody has their own operating model. Everybody has their own UAT process. Everybody has their startup process. Everybody has their contracting process. They're all very different and all very unique and so on. So I do think that partnership there can be driven by by streamlining who you're working with, understanding each other's processes, and instead of trying to build this out maybe with multiple providers.
So, I mean, one of the key components of a kind of partnership model is the governance structure, right? What has always been fascinating to me is that I don't know if this is just an eCOA thing. I've done some work in IRT, randomization, trial supply management. I did other eClinical dynamics, but there seems to be something about eCOA that it really does get run up the flag a lot as being the problem child of the whole clinical technology family, right? And maybe one of the reasons for that is because it's capturing the patient voice directly. Maybe there's an acute awareness, even if it's not supporting a primary or secondary endpoint, not to suggest it shouldn't, the system shouldn't be doing what you contract it to do. But it does seem to me, and Karl, I know you've done work on a range of different platforms as well. Is there an an overly critical viewpoint onto eCOA in particular, where the focus is on the mistake more than the broader successes?
Yeah, I completely agree. I know we can't see each other on the podcast, but I'm sort of laughing as you're giving that example. I had a very heated debate once with a colleague about eCOA versus paper and how eCOA issues, as you say, get run up the flagpole pretty quick. If paper diaries didn't arrive at a site, what would happen? Would we see the same kind of escalation? And I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying somebody wouldn't get into trouble for the paper not arriving, but the issues of a paper booklet not getting where they need to be on time or with a formatting error never seem to make it to study teams that I've been on where we've had just a paper solution. And at the same time, we do eCOA solutions and we insist on having paper. And I've often seen the paper process taking way longer. People assume, oh, we just get a paper copy of the scale. Yes, but then you have to put a header and a footer on it. You might have to create a booklet. You've got to print them. You've got to ship them logistically. You've got to make sure they're getting where they need to go. So I think in my mind, I'll say overreaction to eCOA issues, just for lack of a better term, but I think it's because people feel a little disappointed. They feel the promise of eCOA, reduced burden, speed, better quality, access to patients in broader spectrums. All the stuff that we have always said is the good thing with eCOA. And I think when people buy into it and there's an issue, it's maybe the disappointment that comes through more than perhaps the anger or the frustration. And maybe I'm wrong, but I just think it's something that we see more pronounced than we ever did with a paper diary.
And look, I think an element of that is obviously there's the critical path sensitivity. And I had a eureka moment around the critical path that we might do another podcast on, because I think I came up with a good insight into where the challenge is, but not for today. Look, I would say a bit of the challenges around that is people don't understand eCOA. So look, if you're talking about an IRT system or an EDC system and you're setting that up, people understand that. But when you start talking to sponsors or internal stakeholders, there's a delay in eCOA, and you start talking about copyright holder X or the electronic migration of the file Y and so on, they don't have that deep understanding of the process. It's a little bit, they don't really. I think a lot of maybe the confusion or might get run up the flag a little bit more is, if I don't understand what the problem is, I'm likely to panic a little bit more. I think there really is a lack of deep knowledge with a lot of stakeholders, say clinical project managers or sponsors, around that end-to-end process, from the licensing to the linguistic validation, especially the electronic migration of the translations into the eCOA vendor system. And what you don't really understand kind of scares you a little bit, I think. And hence, I think probably gets one of the reasons it gets flagged up the hole a little bit more than you might see with other systems.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot more moving pieces with eCOA. I think there's a lot more reliance on other stakeholders that are external to the organization that is providing the eCOA solution. Like we've touched on, obviously, the licensing and copyright holders, the translations, but you have the ethics committees, and then also thinking about what's going to then have to be submitted to the regulators. So I think there's definitely lots of moving parts. But I do also think we talk about the benefits of electronic a lot, but it's held to a much higher standard than paper, as we've said, which I still find really interesting. That even in regulatory guidance, I think you see a lot more concern almost around electronic implementation and risk mitigations, or certain things that you should do to ensure that it's still, fit for purpose. In a way that I think that was the paper. I don't think we ever had all of these things outlined when you're doing a paper implementation. I just think it's an interesting one that it's still held to a much higher standard, despite the fact it is superior in most ways.
I love that example, and I've often shared with people the EQ5D on paper. So maybe people don't think about this, and maybe people just don't ask because it is potentially a question we've never asked. When you issue somebody the EQ5D on paper in the EU, we're using A4 paper, right? If you issue it to somebody at a site in the US, we're using US letterhead. Now, I've seen studies that have created paper booklets, and when they go to scale up the temperature scale at the end of the EQ5D, and they realize it's not quite printing to the size it should, and then they realize because of printer settings or because of how they've opened the document, they're scaling, visually formatting the page smaller than it should be. And that's before we even go into sizes of paper that we would use in other countries like Japan, right? So for years and years and years, people have been using eCOA and considering, how we compare this to paper. Is it better? Is it worse? And you're right, Flo, we've created, I think, problems that never really existed. We're trying to answer questions we never asked of paper. And there's a classic example of paper. Nobody asks about equivalence between A4 and US letterhead because it doesn't need to be asked. It's an interesting one.
And yet BYOD and all of the different screen sizes has been a massive pain point for, I think we're coming out of it now, but it's definitely been a massive topic of conversation for many years.
Absolutely. We've touched on 27 different podcast opportunities there, haven't we, really? Backups, BYOD, paper. Paper is still a thing, and it's just amazing. But even that's part of the overall partnership discussion, right? It's about making the right decision for a trial or a program. So partnership can work, though, right? Can we conclude briefly as a group that partnership can work if it's structured appropriately and there's that mutual understanding of what each can bring to the table?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Did you enjoy this episode? Share it with a friend or colleague, or leave a review on iTunes, and help others discover and support our mission. We are welcoming guests with a range of experiences and viewpoints. The views expressed belong to the guests themselves. Learn more about Critical Path Institute at cpath.org. That's c-path.org. Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon, and thanks for listening.